What's up, everyone? Sorry if that's a little loud. I am messing with the audio. I think the last couple videos were a little quiet, but Kane here, captain of the Day's Pirates, uh, here with a video about getting started with building RP Luffy. How you can kind of piece this deck together with what you have around, maybe some friends in the area, things like that. But before we jump all the way into it, a couple quick announcements. I guess for one thing, I am going to try and timestamp this video so you can use it as a resource going forward. But then also, a couple other things. We're at like 120 subs already, which again, much faster growth than I even expected. So very grateful for everyone that has subbed, and I encourage you to do so as well if you're liking the videos. For this channel, through '08 at least, I am going to be completely focused on RP Luffy as far as content goes on this channel. Um, in '09, if I start to play PB or Robin a little bit more competitively, maybe they slip into some of this content. But '09, Luffy's looking great as well, and we'll talk about that. So this channel is going to be focused on RP Luffy and gameplay. Um, but I am pushing for 500 subs, so I'm going to do a giveaway when I do get to 500 subs. Depending on about how long that takes, we'll kind of firm up what that giveaway will look like when we get to it. To that end, maybe around the time '09 comes out, we could do some cool stuff with '09, but we'll see. I appreciate the support that's been happening so far. Real quick, too, I do actually have sim access finally. So if there'd be interest in me seeing me play on the sim, maybe a more live recording of games or something like that, let me know. I really love recording the in-person gameplay, and I love playing paper more than anything. But now that I do have sim access, I'll be able to start giving you guys some '09 lists. I know I've been getting asked about that in some of the discords, and then also give me a little bit more robust testing. So I'm very excited to have that rolled out. But if you guys want to see some sim gameplay from me as well, I could definitely do that as I start to test more of '08. I did get my first event in '08, went 3-1 pretty handily. Didn't see any new cards, but the deck's still fun. But yeah, so that's kind of it on 500 subs. That's the goal. We're about 120 right now, so already growing way faster than I expected. So appreciate that. Then for kind of coming out of this, right? I'm going to talk about this. This video is going to be focused on building RP Luffy, what pieces to prioritize, what pieces maybe you can kind of sub out while you're either not wanting to spend the money or maybe just can't spend the money yet. Totally reasonable, right? So we'll talk about a lot of options. So the timestamps I think will be valuable for you. But coming out of this, right, this is going to be strictly just talking about building the deck. Into '08, I want to talk about where I see the deck going, a little bit more about the meta, and maybe some matchup breakdowns. So if you guys have any kind of requests around content, kind of more supplemental like this, where I talk through some things, I think at least matchups would be pretty helpful. But yeah, beyond that, I will talk some more about some potentials in '08, and I'll kind of allude to some of that in this video. But some of my more experienced pilots might want to just watch that shorter '08 video than pick through this one for those '08 references. So some of it will be talked about here, but I do want to do a more robust '08 video, at least on the card options and where I see the deck going personally. But if you have any other requests there, please do let me know. I'm happy to fill that in. And the final announcement here is that we will have Days Pirates YouTube channel launching pretty soon. So maybe not today because I'm going to upload this today, but when I get that channel created, I will link it. Go sub there. It's going to be a little bit more of a collaborative channel for as we continue to grow the Days Pirates. But right now it's me, Dempsey, and Teddy. Me and Teddy are going to record a VV versus Croc arc battle tomorrow, so that'll probably be the first video that we post on that channel. But then beyond that, I know Dempsey has some interest in doing some box openings on channel and maybe going through all the sets and doing some openings as well. And we'll be doing some different supplemental stuff there. That's where I'll probably post anything not RP Luffy related. Will be probably be on that channel for the time being. And then maybe, like I said, competitively, I'm going to try and drive this channel that way. So if I change it away from RP Luffy in any way, which I don't see it happening right now, this channel is where that would land. So great stuff. But yeah, let's go ahead and jump into the video and kind of a pitch on why you might even want to play RP Luffy at all, really. So a couple of reasons, really. For me personally, I got into the game because I started watching the show and I love Luffy and I wanted to play with the Gear 5 card with some of my Magic friends. I really never expected to compete at a high level or even want to start a YouTube channel around or any of this. So I really just wanted to play this deck because I just thought it was cool. I thought it was going to be a casual, fun little thing for me. But I really fell in love with it and found a way to make it work within, a pretty competitive meta. So I do take some pride in that. But the main reason, yeah, just to be able to be Luffy. Everyone's rooting for the main character. You get some great responses from people at events for being, sticking to your leader. But then a little bit more game mechanically, we can talk a little bit more about game mechanically, why we might want to play this deck and why I am insisting on playing this deck at the highest level right now. Um, One thing, 6,000 power leader is fundamentally just a game changing mechanic. It completely throws off and manipulates your opponent's thought process, sequencing, game plan, everything. That 1,000 really does make a big difference. And you'll see throughout, I've tried to call it on my gameplay, where like that 6,000 makes a big difference. And obviously, some of the things we build into the deck take it even further. Beyond that, not just defensively being able to protect yourself and aggressively swing with that 6K leader. The Gear 5 Luffy that we'll talk about is one of my favorite threats in the deck. That card literally is the reason why I got into the game and wanted to start buying it. I still haven't seen the Gear 5 episode. I'm on like 890 or something like that, but I can't wait. But to that end, it's just the most dynamic game-winning card that exists right now. I don't think I can really state it better than that. You will find lines to win the game where no other deck would ever have an opportunity to. And it's a pretty phenomenal feeling when you piece those things together. Fundamentally, the deck is pretty straightforward and strong and proactive. You are an aggressively front facing deck, a little bit more mid range than some of the like hyper aggressive decks out there, like Zoro and some other things like that. We're a little bit more mid range than that, but we are still a very proactive, focused game plan that's just very strong on curve plays. Another reason to that end, I'll kind of, I guess, hit that in a second. The other thing that people hear, or as they're getting into the game and considering this leader, or I still get this feedback from people, is that 3 life is terrifying to some people, or they think it's like you're just going to get ruined by it all the time. You know what? Yes, sometimes if you do get absolutely no counter in hand, you can lose a little quicker than you might expect, even with that 6K leader. But that's not really the norm. I hope you've seen that from my channel, and I've tried to call that out as well. That 6,000 power and the way that this deck functions, you make those cards up. The dynamic is true that you do see less cards, and there will be games where you maybe not see all the pieces that you wanted to see in that matchup. It happens to everybody, even the Luchis and the most premier decks, don't always hit their pieces. Um, so you do get a few less cards, but realistically, that card economy and the dynamic that your opponent has to play through, I personally find it to be absolutely worth it. Obviously, there is counterplay to this strategy. If your opponent's very aggressive with those 6K swings, they can kind of chip away at your hand. And if you don't have the pieces, you fall behind a little bit. Absolutely. But when you're playing on curve, I think this deck is one of the strongest in the game. Some games feel absolutely dominating. And then kind of going into '09 and, maybe one last reason, I originally picked this deck up because I wanted to play off meta. Realistically, I like to play this game, but I know for a fact I have less time to play it than some other people that are grinding a little bit more aggressively and playing some of the same tournaments that I'm trying to, and also coming into the game much later than some of them as well. Realistically, I am trying to put myself in a position where when I go into those big tournament events and I'm sitting across from somebody that's never sat across from me before, I'm more comfortable in this matchup than they are. If they've been grinding Lucci for the entire last set and they've been playing Lucci at their locals against every single person for the entire last set, now they're playing it in '08 as well. I've played more games against Lucci than they have played against RP Luffy. I know that for almost a fact. Maybe if they're hyper grinding on the sim or something like, but I'm playing very tight, very intentional locals games against Lucci weekly. And they are not playing against my RP Luffy or me in that same style. So that's part of the reason that I do like the deck. I do feel like I am able to accrue an advantage where I would usually be disadvantaged. If I'm walking into a Lucci mirror against that person, I know for a fact they've played more Lucci mirrors than me. If they're playing multiple nights a week or doing different things, or now I have sim access, so maybe that'll change too. But I know they're more comfortable in a Lucci mirror or Lucci versus Black Yellow Luffy, even though that might be favored for me as Black Yellow Luffy. I know they've played that matchup more and they have a better control and understanding of that micro. Whereas I, as an RP Luffy player, am currently very strong or have my thoughts together as far as that goes. And to that end, though, going into '09, this might be a meta contender. We might be a top 3 meta deck according to what some of the Japanese lists are looking like today. So I'm building, again, I'll have advantage over those mirror matches now that I've been grinding this deck for the last 2 or 3 sets when they maybe are picking it up now that it is stronger. So we'll see how that plays out in '09. I am really making a push to get a Nationals invite because then January Nationals is played in the '09 format. We could really ball out with RP Luffy there. But got to get through these regionals the next couple months. But yeah, I think that's why you play the deck. Obviously, you can copy paste top 5 meta lists from every other channel besides me. I mean, they're great decks. I don't have any knock against playing that, but we love our Luffy and we love this list. So I appreciate you checking it out and wanting to look through this video. So fundamentally, I kind of have this deck composition broke down into categories. And then with each category, I'll kind of break down some of the best and maybe filler options as you're building out the deck. Because relatively, we'll talk a little bit more about it. Some of the pieces and kind of some of, I guess you could say the staples to the deck, even though it's not a Straw Hat staple, some of the other big pieces to the deck are on the pricier side, a little bit higher than where you'd want to pay per card, maybe. So we'll talk all about all that. I'm not going to go through a ton of prices, but you'll see some of the prices on the page, and we'll go through that. But yeah, 8 to 10 Straw Hat staples. I'll kind of break that down. That's basically Nami plus some additional counters that I just feel like are fundamental to the deck. 7 to 10 ramp. This entire game plan is built on, I guess I haven't really addressed that. As a game plan and for a deck, what we're trying to do is get ahead of our opponent on Don, and then play big bodies and chain them into a gear 5, which then just is overwhelming pressure. And again, from the leader perspective, the 6K 3 life leader with an activate main effect to ramp 1 Don, to set 1 Don as active from your Don deck if you have 0 or 8 Don. I'm not doing a full deck tech today, but it just kind of just so you know what that leader is doing. I'm thinking if you got to this point, you've read the card before, but I guess I probably should have pulled that up, and I will pull that up actually. But carrying on, that ramp, most people say you want to be over 8. I've actually cut down a little bit recently, and I'll talk more about why I'm there. But 7 to 10 ramp cards to put you ahead on your Don. And then your 2Ks. This deck does generally run a little bit less 2Ks than a lot of other decks. Because we are that 6K leader, fundamentally, most players are going to pressure us with a lot of 6K swings or exactly hits. So 1Ks work just as well as 2Ks in a lot of scenarios. Obviously, when they're trying to pressure you out more, you do want those 2Ks, but 4 to 8, I've been on like 6 to 7 and loving it. Really haven't felt like that's been my downfall. Funnily, we have 10 to 12 slots dedicated to threats, and if I lose a game, that's usually where I'm lacking. I feel like I didn't see the top end that I wanted to, and I really only got to play some, piddly bodies or maybe some blockers, and then had to don up a lot of swings. So that even though that is a large chunk of our deck, that does seem to still be kind of where it can be a little bit frustrating at times, I guess you could say. 3 to 6, I have removal / counters. I do have some counters in my Straw Hat staples, but some more utility counters, some of the things that you guys have seen me play through 07 will be categorized in there. And obviously your removal along with that. Because this deck is so proactive and you are playing so forward facing and swinging aggressively, sometimes you are going to check into board, and especially in certain matchups that are more aggressive, you become the control deck over like a Zoro or something like that. But at the end of the day, we're not going to keep up with Lucian removal. We need to be hitting face, making them play into our board and play around us. And then 4 to 8 blockers, again, fundamentally with some of the threats that we play, we also become extremely strong defensively. And blockers just aren't quite as effective for us as they might be for some other decks. That being said, we still do have a strong core of blockers that we don't want to cut away from in any way, in my opinion. But with these numbers, the low range if you took the lowest number on all of them, you get 36. If you take the highest number on all of them, you get 54. It's a 50 card deck. So obviously you kind of have some room to slide these things back and forth, and you see me tweaking with it constantly. But that's kind of the core composition of the deck. And then we'll talk some more about kind of where you're going to get started and whether or not you want to start with buying an ST10 or not. So of course, technically, this leader, of course, technically, this leader is a starter deck leader, right? So you could just buy the starter deck to get started. No, that's fine. That's a little redundant. Um, but to that end, I I don't know. I don't think it's a bad choice. I started with two ST10s when I was my first couple purchases getting into the game. But realistically, it's kind of an upside to it and a downside to it. If you're brand new to the game, you don't have 50 cards yet, you don't have Don, buying one of the starter decks to get 50 cards that work, Don, and a deck box, if you're not, trying to be super price efficient, I would absolutely do that still. I think it's worth it. Just to kind of get you, a foundation. If you already have a level of cards in the, from buying boxes and things like that, you might be able to piece it together for a little cheaper. So we'll talk some more about that. Like realistically, within your one ST10, you're only going to get like 8 to 12 cards that like you really, really want to use in the long run. There's a lot of functional pieces still. So like I said, I don't think it's a complete waste. But realistically, out of like the things that are most important, your leader is going to be about $2. You'll get two of the 7 cost kids, which we'll talk about as a threat. They're about $5 each. A lot of decks play four. I play three. So I mean, if you get two, that's about $10 that you would have paid on those. You get two of the 4 cost blocker law. I think it's extremely important in the meta and making up the card advantage that we lose. I'll talk about that in the blocker section, but there's two of those. I run two personally, so that's about $10. They do give you a foil Nami Straw Hat Searcher. That a play set of them is about $5. And then the 3 cost Rush Zoro and also the Gene Barts in the deck. Some people play as well. I'll talk about the Gene Bart later, but again, that's about 8 to 12 cards that you might use. Realistically, I think you'll swap out a lot of that in the long run. But again, it does get you off the ground and gets you running. If not, that's where I'm going to go into these next couple sections where it's each of those categories that I just listed, but then broken down further into Premier, kind of being the threats that I'm actively playing, actively looking to play. The role players, maybe a little bit more mid tier, or a lot other people do like them more than I personally do. Right? I'm not infallible. I'm not trying to say I have the perfect RP Luffy list. It's just something I've dedicated a lot of time to. And then what I consider a little bit more like I'm calling it filler, thematically. But like again, if you have bulk around, you got friends that have bought boxes of other sets. I know when I was getting into the game, if Esteban, if you're watching this, huge shout out to you for being a huge help to me and Teddy as we're getting up and running with some of our, and Eugene as well. I bought a lot of stuff from. But having some great locals that are going to help you out and sell you some cards or give you some of their bulk to fill out some of this stuff. If you have a good scene around you, obviously that's amazing as well. Um, if you're just playing on the sim, you can copy paste, the top cards and play it on the sim, and you're good to go. But yeah, just kind of trying to make this more dynamic for people that are, trying to take this to locals and get the hang of it before just purchasing, 50 cards. Because realistically, this isn't the cheapest deck in the meta, even though it is an off meta take. Some of the cards do have a little bit of a price tag, and there is a consideration to that. So again, I'm not going to break down every single price in this extensively, but I am going to speak to some of that and highlight some of that as well. So getting started here with our premier, our straw hat staples here. Um, so I have One Piece top decks pulled up here. I'm sorry, One Piece Limitless search engine here, so I can pull through these cards. You can see so many prices on the side. I'm not going to address every single one, but in the starter deck, obviously you get 4 of these Nami. So, like I said, about $5 or so. But it's a 1 cost. Search the top 5 for straw hats other than Nami, and put the rest on the bottom. Fundamentally, this gets you so many important pieces, counters, the staples that I'm going to talk about, your Gear 5 win con. Um, there are people that do play around with a Nami list. I personally don't see it quite yet. I think a lot of games that go long, especially having that additional filtering and look, I think is extremely important for our deck that is low on card advantage, right? But I could see some validity to it, I suppose, especially going into '09. We get a lot of dynamic threats, but we do get a lot more straw hats too. So I don't know. I think I'll be on 4 Namis as long as I can see. But some people trim one, some people cut it all together. And real quick, I have a ton of tabs here open. so I'm not gonna have to search a ton. But I did not think about pulling up the leader until a second ago. So we are gonna hit that real quick. Again, 6,000 power, 3 life leader, which is your disadvantage. Usually the simple is 5,004 for your 2 colors. But I'm telling you, you make up that advantage pretty quickly with the way the deck is built. And once per turn, if you have 0 or 8 or more down, you ramp 1. So basically, as soon as you hit 8 down, you go to 9. As soon as you hit 9 down, you go to 10. That's fundamentally just guaranteed ramp at your top end. So if you can ramp to that 8 even faster, right, you have a guaranteed jump ahead again at that point. And then with the 0 down cards, if you're new to the game, you might be like, when would I ever have 0 down card? The first turn I get a Don, and then I have Don. But Don minus effects, specifically our Gear 5 win con, which will be the first thread I talk about, um, it sets you -10, so then you're down to 0, and you get to use that leader effect. I've talked about another deck text, but just want to kind of shout that out again real quick. Our next Straw Hat staple here is Radical Beam. So uh, this is when you have it's a 1 cost 2K counter, but then if you have 2 or less life, you get an additional 2K counter on that. So functionally, after you've taken 1 life with this leader, right, you go from 3 to 2. And then 1 cost 4K counter. And with our 6K leader, remember, that means we counter out of a 9K swing. So like your 8 cost Gecko Moria is a 9K. If they swing that at you, 1 Don, get out of that attack. Fundamentally extremely powerful down the stretch. And realistically, like this card's so powerful that I cut 1 because threatening 1 against good players is just as good as having 1 a lot of the time. Because they're going to just keep swinging at you with low hits as long as they can. Obviously, you do want to see them. Maybe I will go back up to 4. But right now I'm on 3 because, again, just leaving 1 down open, your opponent, a skilled opponent is going to play around that. But yeah, just something to kind of shout out or think about there. Then 2 others that I do have here. Diablo Jambe. So I did say their counters. This one is activate main. But it makes one of your Straw Hat crew, leader, or characters unable to be blocked. So if your opponent has 0 life, basically you can Don up your leader with 9 Don, which is a 15K swing, and then make them unblockable. And your opponent has to be able to counter out of that or they lose. Um, this, especially in conjunction with our Gear 5 win con, is just insane. Uh, Opponents have to be constantly aware of this potential. And if you just get ahead of them, they just don't stand a chance. So against some laws before it was banned, I would get them down to 0 life. They'd play 2 blockers and go, I hope you don't have John Bay. And then usually I would have John Bay. I run 2 of them personally. I think that's a pretty healthy number. And again, that's why I push the Nami so much. And I want 4 Namis. Help me cycle more into these. But this card is phenomenal. And sometimes even that trigger will just snipe a blocker too, which is nice. But that's kind of our third Straw Hat staple. Then our Gum Gum Jet Gatling here. This is the purple 0 cost event where you trash a card from your hand and you get a 3K counter. This deck is very threat dependent. A lot of our top end does not have any counter as it currently stands. So being able to get rid of maybe a spare Jambe, a spare Gear 5, or just any other card to be able to counter out of an attack for 8K into us is phenomenal. I am going to shout out, this is a Straw Hat crew card, right? Obviously, Straw Hat staple. There is a red 0 cost event that is also a Straw Hat crew card. I prefer Jet Galling because this trigger is so much more proactive and powerful. Realistically, if you hit this out of your first life, you get to slingshot up a Don, and I've won games off the back of that trigger. Genuinely, just put ahead. I never fall behind again, and I just win. And then if you get this out of a later life, you just don't trigger it. You just don't trigger it, and you just have a counter, and you can trash a card to get a 3K counter. I'm going to close this. I think this is the 0 cost event to play. Anywhere from 2 to 4 of them. I'm personally on 2 right now. I guess it is a couple bucks. So, it is a consideration. But this card is a little bit cheaper. And maybe if someone has this around but not Jet Gatling, you could use this as well. Because it is still Straw Hat searchable. It's still a trash to get a 3K counter. This trigger, though, is much more defensive. And yes, coming out of your life later, it could absolutely save you. But the way I look at this and the way a lot of other people look at this is that this trigger is only really better than the counter if I'm at like 1 or 0 cards in hand. And at that point, yes, triggering when I would not be able to otherwise pitch or I might need that threat to win next turn or something like that could be the scenario. It just isn't really usually. I I've had the proactive trigger come up a lot, and I've had almost no times where I've gotten Jet Gatling out of life and gone, I wish this had the trigger instead because it's still a 0 cost 3K counter event. And usually the problem when we lose games isn't because we're completely out of cards. We still have 2 or 3 threats in our hand or 2 or 3 non-counters in our hand that we just didn't get to play yet, or something more along those lines is far more common than a case where we're absolutely out of cards and wanting to utilize this trigger. If that makes sense. But that's your Straw Hat staples. Like I said, Bad Manners Kick Course from OP04 is kind of a little bit of a uh, double check there, I guess you could say. Um, so pivoting away from that and going directly into our premier threats. These are kind of the threats that I'm looking to play on my deck right now most actively. Rayleigh's kind of intentionally left off here because he's a considered removal, just kind of for my categorization here. But I am absolutely going to be playing OP08 Rayleigh as well. But for this list here, I'm starting with our Gear 5. Again, this is, in my opinion, the reason to play this deck. Some people do cut it. I personally will never. I would probably just play a different deck than cut this, most likely. But there's some other cases to have. We can talk about that in 09 potentially as well. But on play, Don -10. That's all of your Don, right? That's the most Don you can have. And then you also get rid of all of your characters on board. Then you take an extra turn after this one. So generally, you swing out with your board, play this leader, or play this -10, activate your leader, then you have 1 Don. Then you have 1 Don to use this ability to be able to add a second Don. And then you can either use that 1 Don for an effect, or you can just swing 7,000 with your leader, take your extra turn, and then, swing big or make other plays with a 4 Don available the following turn. Even from an empty board, this says for 10 Don, you swing 7,000, draw a card, swing up to 10,000 with your leader, and swing 12,000 with Gear 5. That's just at least, really. So that's where I still do say to a lot of people that the tempo Gear 5 play sometimes is just correct. If your only threat in hand is a Gear 5 Luffy and your opponent's cleared your entire board, just send it. That extra card economy is worth it for you most of the time. And then you can even play it more controlling and use that 12K to swing into a threat on their end, potentially. Obviously, if you're not able to kill them. But this card is kind of creeping up a little bit. I think I got them for like $7 or $8. So, if you want to buy 3 of these, it isn't the cheapest thing in the world. But I do think fundamentally to the deck, I would highly suggest at least getting 2 or 3. And I think you'll have a great time with this card, personally. USS Captain Kidd. This does come in the ST10. So like I said, if you buy that ST10, you do get 2 of these. On play and when attacking, -1 Don. Up to one of your leaders gain plus 1,000 till the start of your next turn. So if you play this on your 7 Don turn, your leader becomes 7,000. Then your next turn you swing with it at 7,000 again, and your opponent has to deal with removing the 7 cost 8K. Absolutely phenomenal. This card is crucial in your aggressive matchups, playing against Reiju, Zoro, Law previously. This card would just win that matchup by creating a dynamic threat and also buffing you defensively. Right now, I still think this is the best 7-drop that we have access to. I personally would never cut below 3 in 08. I might go up to 4, honestly. But this card is very good. And with this Don -1, something that you might not necessarily think of immediately with our RP Luffy effect. If you're at 10 Don and then you activate a Don -1 effect, you can then activate your leader and you kind of functionally have an 11th Don for that turn. It's a little thing, but it does enact some plays that are pretty unique to this deck, and it is a nice upside, especially with this card. So, a few bucks there. Again, if you're starting with the starter deck, you get 2 of them. You can buy 2 more, or you could just, buy a play set to get up and running. I was going to do a little bit more price breakdowns, but I think situations are so different specifically that I'd rather kind of help you individually. If you had some questions, to reach out to me and I can kind of talk through what might be some of the best swaps or the RP Luffy discussion on the big OPTCG Discord is huge. Maybe we'll start a Days Pirates Discord at some point too, but yeah, I think this is definitely a fundamental card. Going into '09. I still expect to be on two or three of them personally, but we'll see kind of where everything takes us there. Edward Newgate. 9 cost, again, kind of one that a lot of people find very fundamental to the leader. 9 cost, 10k. Up to one of your leaders gains 2,000 power until the start of your next turn. Then you cannot add life from your own effects. That secondary piece isn't really relevant to us. It's for the Newgate leader. But with our leader, just like Newgate, it makes us into an 8k leader. Extremely powerful defensively. Basically makes your opponent decide between swinging into you and playing Gecko Moria if you're playing as a black deck or some other threats. But yeah, that 8K leader is huge. A lot of people just have to take a turn off from swinging into you, or they have to commit their entire turn into swinging into you. And if you have the counter, you probably just win from there. At the start of '08, this card has seen an uptick in price because of Marco. I don't know if it's going to go back down immediately. Um, I run three personally. It is a little bit steep, so this is one that if you have other threats available, maybe prioritize this a little bit less. Oh yeah, that's a good thing to shout out too. PRB and comes out in October, I believe, for us. This is being reprinted in that set as well. So is Gear 5 Luffy. So it might be a great time to build that deck about the time PRB comes out if you're missing some of these pieces to fill that out. But then on top of that, the Don X2 KO, when attacking KO up to one of your opponent's characters of 3k or less. Very nice to be able to play this and then swing 12k and KO like a small blocker like Rebecca or something like that. That removal, isn't the most important thing in the world to us per se, but it's very good. This card is phenomenal, and again, I really expect it to be in the deck through '09, very likely. Dragon. This is a '07 card that has played phenomenally for me. I'm on, well, technically two of it right now, but three realistically. Um, it has Rush, so it's an 8k at cost, 9k Rush, and then on play, give up to 2 Rested Don to a character or leader. So even if you, again, empty board situation, like a Lucci's removing your board up the curve, and then you play this, you can either go 8k with your leader, then 9k with Dragon, or you can go like 6k and then 11k. Or if you have other cards, obviously you can distribute it a little bit differently. I find myself frequently going Eustace Kid and then playing Dragon the following turn and putting the 2 Rested Don on Kid and swinging 9 with Dragon, 10 with Kid, activate effect to make my leader 7k, and swing either 7 or 8 into the leader last. I know technically you want to swing your smallest first, but that's kind of the way you can maximize your Don with the Don minus and all that. A little bit mechanically there, but it's just a phenomenal rush threat, especially against decks that are removing you over and over and over and over again. Either on curve, they have to swing into 9k to try and kill it on board, or after they've removed your board to just be able to create dynamic threats. It's also helped me a lot against the Nell. They take that first life with like a 6k or 7k swing, and then they activate their leader effect, and then you just slam a dragon, swing a full 11k into them, and they have to counter out of that to protect their leader effect at that point. This one's a bit cheaper, only a couple bucks. So I would highly suggest if you're getting rolling, like 3 or 4 of these as some of your first threats will feel pretty good because you get a play set a bit cheaper than some of the other ones. That's something to consider as well. Kid into Dragon is phenomenal. Our 6 cost pre-release promo Zoro for a 7k banish, and it's a 1k counter. The fact that this is a Straw Hat crew with that counter is absolutely why this is in the deck, in my opinion. It does fill the slot on our six cost curve. We don't have really anything else to play on 6 cost right now. But even that being the case, this does help against yellow. This does hurt an L quite a bit. But the fact that it has that 1k counter is so important for us because then we can get rid of it once we're past that and we have other threats to play. But sometimes this will be just your best threat. And a 7K banish for 6 cost is very efficient. And it helps us fight back that card advantage game, right? So I was saying the whole game that our disadvantage is in the number of cards we see. That is the only disadvantage that we truly have, in my opinion. And with that being the case, this is something that can help turn that dynamic back in your favor, especially against some of those more grindy decks, 5 life leaders, or an L or yellow in general, realistically. And then this maybe should be a role player, but I have it in Premiere because I'm going to test it out, starting this set out. The reason that people are a little bit low on this is two reasons. One, you have to on play, down -1, and trash a card from your hand. If we're hurting ourselves in cards, a lot of people are terrified of that. I want to test it out though, because realistically, if you're getting rid of a brick that you couldn't play otherwise to then gain a life, it's kind of like you cycled a card, or maybe even better than just drawing a card, right? Because now this is a life. But then you can, it is optional, you don't have to, put one of your opponent's life characters into life. So yeah, if you're playing this, you probably want to do that most often, I think. But if you don't want to do that, you don't have to. You can just gain the life and develop a body. Or maybe against somebody like, putting Sabo into life, putting Rebecca into life, putting a brick into life, against Bonnie, putting Cavendish into life. All those seem pretty good to me. Against Anel, putting a non-trigger at the bottom of their life. I don't know. I need to play test it. I hope you guys see it in this week's gameplay, but maybe this is more of a role play or a filler. I think they're about $5 right now, a little bit less than maybe. So I don't have any real testing on this yet, but I do think this is a valid threat and maybe a cheaper replacement for Newgate in the meantime. If you're looking for a good 9 cost threat and you don't have Newgate, this is probably where I'd personally go, especially for the price. But yeah. So again, like I said, like maybe could have been shifted down to the role player here, but I I shifted it to Premier because it's in my list right now. And that being said, oh, Kaido and Linden's actually an '08 card, but we're going to leave that typo in there and go on to our next page here. So it is a 10 cost. Uh, when attacking, Don -10, KO everything, gain a life, and trash one of your opponent's lives. I do think this is a bit slow. I do not necessarily know if this will be in my list long term. I have one in right now. Again, I think against yellow, they really can only Kingdom Come this. That's like their only way to remove it, basically. So against an L, this could just be a massive swing and threat, and against some other leaders as well. Um, I don't know, though. I might cut it back for my third gear 5, but it is a pretty powerful threat. The fact that it's on when attacking, you do have to rest all your Don. They kind of leave yourself defensive open unless you have like a kid to reset one down for a radical beam or something like that. So it's absolutely you got to kind of make sure you got counter or you got some sort of a sequence of a play to not die the turn after you play this. But if you get to untap with it, you probably aren't losing. So we'll see. We'll see if it comes up for me or not. Another 10 cost. The reason that funnily that I want to play Kaido and Linlin because the reason I don't like Shanks is the fact that you rest 10 down and kind of have to leave yourself open to being swung on. This does give you an on play that KOs a 10k or less, which obviously helps you defensively a bit more proactively than Kaido and Linlin does. So I can't really tell someone not to run it. I just didn't love it. I just didn't really enjoy it when I played it. And for that reason, I don't have it in the deck, and I don't think I'll be putting it back in. Um, but it is a 12k body. This is phenomenal into an L because you can KO basically every threat that an L plays, whether it's a Katakuri, an Ace, or a Yamato, and then develop a 12k to swing into them. So again, it's phenomenal for that matchup. But I don't see that matchup weekly. So that might be part of the reason why I'm a little bit lower on it than many others. Now we're going a little bit lower on the curve, a little bit more early game threats or dynamic threats. Kid and Killer. This is probably one of the best red cards for a lot of decks. The ability to make a 4 cost rusher that swings for 7,000 if your opponent has 2 or less life is very good. Where this found a slot in my deck at one point was the fact that after you play Gear 5, the following turn you have 4 active Don. And with that being the case, you can go 6K leader, 7K kid and killer, 12K with gear 5. So that extra attack did win me a good handful of games. Um, but that being said, I replaced it with Dragon just because Dragon's a little bit much better to play without Gear 5. And ideally, with Gear 5, I don't want to need to hit with the 7K, ideally. But it's still absolutely valid. And if you're playing like the purple searcher or something, I could see it even more so. But I just think Dragon's better. There is also a deck list that uses a card called Black Maria, and we can talk more about that. But there's like a more aggressive build that uses Kid and Killer a little bit more. But I think I'll talk more about that in like my actual '08 video. I don't got to get into all that right now. Our last role player, not quite our last role player, the second to last role player is Monkey D. Luffy. This is from the first starter deck. It's a 5 cost 6K rush with no counter. And if you put 2 down on it, it is not blockable. And this is a great card. I had it in a lot of my early versions of the deck. It's a few bucks, so if you have it around or you got friends or you have the deck access to the deck box or something, or I guess if you buy the tournament pack one, it's only $1. That's nice. But I have cut it because functionally Diable Jambe lets your leader be this for 1 cost. I have a 6K leader already. I pay 1 to make him unblockable, and I have the whole rest of my 9 Don, whereas this has to be 7 Don to swing for 8,000. I have heard a lot of support for this. The fact that it is a more dynamic mid-game threat kind of hurts Bonnie a little bit more because Bonnie plays a ton of blockers, and I could absolutely see that. Um, but right now, I don't have it, and I can't seem to find slots for it. That's just not where I would be with it personally. I think, again, just kind of having Kid and Killer or Dragon as rush threats is a little bit better. That being said, we do have one last 6 cost kind of filler, or this is still our role players. On play, well, it's a Straw Hat Sanji, 1K counter. On play, if your opponent has 5,000 or more power character, it gains a rush this turn. So just a solid 6 cost 6K rush that also has a 1K counter. It's also searchable. It comes in the starter deck. I don't know if I would go out of my way to buy these. Some people do play it in a more aggressive style too. Newgate plays this in its deck, so it kind of feeds into that. But um, I just think it's outclassed a little bit by some of the other threats that we do have available. But if you're starting with the ST10 or you have them around, it's a great card in the meantime. So that will be our role players. Going into our filler threats, a little bit more dynamic. I'm not going to talk about these quite as much because I think kind of the message across the board is that I would just probably replace them with other things as soon as possible. But in the meantime, you can use them. Again, this is a starter deck card, so that could be a reason to use it if you have the ST10. It's a 10 cost 11K rusher that when your opponent tries to block, you KO up to one of their characters 8K or less. When I did have it in the deck, it did make for some dynamic lines. The reason I actually cut it was because of Bond Clay and Law. I tried to play it into 2 Bond Clays, thinking he would block and I'd be able to KO one of the Bond Clays and it'd be fine. And he just didn't block, and then swung at me with the blocker and 2 11K Bond Clays the next turn and just destroyed me. I was like, okay, yeah, I see why this is not the best threat in the entire world, but it is a big rush card that if you have it, it's a great filler, a great threat for the meantime. Sangoro, some people play this over the Banish Zoro. It's cheaper. But personally, I just think Banish Zoro is better. It's just a vanilla 1K. It does all the same things as Banish Zoro, but it doesn't have Banish. Afro Luffy, it's a 6 cost that has down -3. If your opponent has 3 or more characters, you can attack with it twice. It's actually a decently powerful threat and can really kind of mow somebody down if you just put all your down on them. But it just gets outclassed and it has no counter. But if you have this around, you open some 07, it can absolutely be something that probably wins you a game or two while you're building things out. Uta, this one's a couple bucks, so maybe not the most cheap free filler around. But if someone has it or if you've opened O2, it's on play Dom -2 for an effect similar to Kid, but it also affects your characters. And she's an AK. I had her in my first build of the deck, but I cut her relatively quickly. But yeah, it will fill that role. And Shanks is another big rusher. It's a few bucks, so maybe not the cheapest, but again, if you have it around or a friend has one in their binder, you could probably use it. They can't block it with small blockers. Against a Rebecca meta, it's pretty good. But yeah, it just gets outclassed by other rushers and being a little bit less efficient than other cards, in my opinion. But that could be your filler threats. From there, we're jumping into ramp. Premier ramp is unfortunately a relatively short list. Ramp is something that is not fully fleshed out mechanically, in my opinion. Probably for a good reason, realistically. Law really abused ramp, and a lot of other leaders can really abuse ramp. So I'm not mad that they're being reserved with it, but realistically, the premier ramp slots are kind of two right now. And this is where my one disclaimer does come that this card is pretty expensive, like 30 bucks a piece. If you're buying a playset that's over $100, I understand that's a big investment. I am gonna have to unfortunately say that like if you really love this deck and you want to play it in the long term, I would suggest you kind of plan to get four of them over time. But it's not mandatory for the deck to function. But this is one of the very few cards that I'm pretty locked in on having four of in my deck. And I wish it was a little cheaper. I hope they print some more EBO1 or something. But the fact that this is a four cost, it is only a 1K. And it has a 1K counter. But on play, you get an active Dom. So it puts you from. Just think about this. You're on second. You take your second turn. You play Bon Curry. That puts you up to 5. Your next turn, you go to 7. You play Kid. Use this Captain Kid on turn 3, or banish Zoro there and have a Don left over. Then you go to either 8 or 9. If you'd use the Kid, you'd go to 8, but then your leader puts you up to 9. So you could realistically go turn 2 Kid, Bon Curry, turn 3 Kid, turn 4 Newgate, turn 5 Gear 5, and I have won games like that just because they couldn't answer those threats, and I just literally won on turn 5 because I got to take an extra turn. Um, and then when attacking, this does copy one of your opponent's characters. So as they're playing up their curve, they're going to provide bigger and bigger threats for you to swing into them with. So I've swung with Bon Clays being like 10Ks or 8Ks or downed up, and it's even bigger. Um, and then it's also just a counter. If you don't need the threat or you don't need the ramp later, you just counter it away. So yeah, it's just so phenomenal. It's one of the very few slots that I just have a firm four of, kind of like Nami. But again, that price tag does kind of hurt my feelings. Then the other one, Zoro Juro. This one's much cheaper. You get a play set of them for about $1. This is basically built for this leader. It was released the set after our leader came out. And it says, when attacking, if you have 3 or less life cards, you get an active Dom. So if you're going first, you play this turn 2. Turn 3, you get to ramp it down while swinging this, and then, move forward with whatever other game plan that you want to do or threats you want to play. Yeah, that's really all there is to say about this. A lot of people lock this in as 4. I do only play 3 right now because I just don't ever really want to see it after turn 2. After turn 2, it's going to be a counter like 99% of the time. But you could definitely run 4. I see a lot of people still on 4. I can't contest that. But very functional for the deck. Then going into kind of some of our other options for ramp, I am going to be testing out this new one in 08, but some of our other options do kind of fall off in quality pretty quickly. I was on Miss All Sunday for a lot of last set, but right now I don't have any of these cards in my deck, and I'm just running the 2 on the Premiere page personally. I do think that this It's to Die For could definitely be something, especially with like Doflamingo and things becoming better. It's a 3 cost main event to ramp 1 down. Then if your opponent has a 6K or more, add a second down. So against Doflamingo, I've seen some people say like they go second and then they get to on turn 2 ramp 2 down from 6 or from 4 to 6, and they're on 9 on turn 3, and that's insane. But it is a brick. It is something that once you're at 10 down, it's basically a garbage card. So that's to consider. But I think this might have some legs, especially if we're starting to see a ton of Doflamingos or Lucci keeps slamming those 6K Luccis and bricks on our face. From there, Miss All Sunday. Personally, my favorite character besides Luffy is Robin, so any excuse to play Robin or Miss All Sunday, I was in support of. But at the end of the day, it's a brick, so that's kind of why I had to end up cutting it, because it doesn't have counter in the late game. But on play, add up to 1 down and rest it. And then if you have 6 or more, draw a card. And then it also has a trigger to come out of life as an extra body. this coming out of life did win me games a couple times, but it being no counter just made it so awkward that in a lot of games I would like look at my hand and I feel like I have to play it to draw a card, and that's just not a spot you want to be in. Realistically, I haven't been hurting that much being down on the ramp a little bit. The fact that all of our options are good options really after our first two have no counter, that make it a little tough for a deck like us that have lower card economy in a lot of ways. Lead Performer Disaster. This is one that you'll get recommended a ton to be your maybe eighth, ninth, 10th ramp slot. It shores up your even curve. It also lets you draw a card. Draw one card, get an active Don, and then if you trigger it, it does the exact same effect. I played it very briefly. It just felt like a similar scenario to Miss All Sunday, where realistically, Miss All Sunday at least developed me a body for that one extra Don. But then this effect again, just in the late game, I felt like I had to play it, or it's just a brick that's just sitting in your hand, and like it's not somewhere we can really afford to be, in my opinion. But again, I know a lot of people, including myself, until like 3 weeks ago, was on 9 to 10 ramp. I just think the options fall off hard enough that maybe it's to die for. Being able to double ramp can be there. But yeah, I think some of these other options, and that's why it's kind of unfortunate that Mr. Two is the price that he is. And realistically, that's why Mr. Two is the price that he is, because he is just so far net ahead as being the best ramp tool generically that exists right now. And then I believe I have one more Gene Bart. This does come in the starter deck again. I was on two or three of these, especially if you're on that purple searcher. I don't think I included that. We'll pull it up at that. But it's a 4 cost 5K on play, pay one Don to get an active Don. So realistically, this is a 5 cost 5K with 1K counter to get one active Don. It works. It's functional. I would run. This was probably one of the first ones I would include if I didn't have Bond Clays, uh, just because it does fill a similar role and have that counter for you. But realistically, it just doesn't feel like the best play in a lot of ways too. So that's why I haven't had it in for very much. And then on to our filler ramp. Got a couple options here. Um, oh, I keep forgetting that I already pulled everything up here. Miss Double Finger. Some people play this as a 2K, and I've heard some good reviews of it. It's on play trash one card to get an active Don, or rested Don rather, and it can come out of life, and it's a 2K. So I could see it. Personally, I think I would just rather not ramp than have to give up two cards to ramp, including one of them being my 2Ks. But I have heard other more success for it when they really need that ramp. But more like recently, I've just been downing up more in those games where I don't ramp, and the problem I lose games because I don't have threats, not because I don't have ramp. Most of the time, ramp just makes it even better. Then from there, Basil Hawkins. This was in the deck for a long time until Mister Two came out. A lot of people were playing this as well. I would probably maybe I should have had this a little bit higher because I do realistically think if I don't have if I had zero Bond Clays, I'd probably run four of these. It doesn't provide the same dynamic threat, but it makes your even curve phenomenal. And then it also, the trigger can be good too, and also has a 1K counter. So I think this really maybe should have been one slide earlier, because if I had zero Mr. Twos, I would probably play three or four of these for the time being. Thunder Bagua, this is technically a counter, but when I was running it, it was more excited about the ramp than the 4K power during the battle, which the 4K is good, but it's a 2 cost counter. So it's less efficient than Radical Beam. And again, if your opponent's playing around Radical Beam, they're going to play around this as well. And 2 down is not as good when you're up top at that 10 down curve. Whereas sometimes, yeah, being able to counter out early and ramp could be nice. But most of your opponents aren't swinging at you that hard that early, right? They're probably swinging at you like 7, 6. So it's a little bit of overkill for that ramp. So again, I could see it, and if you have it around, run it. But I would cut it out as you get some of the other counter and ramp threats or options rather. And then that should be it for our ramp section. From there, we'll jump right into our 2Ks. Our premier 2Ks are probably just the two best straw hat 2Ks that exist right now. Sanji is a couple bucks each. So it's not the most important purchase. It doesn't need to be your very first purchase. What this says is that if your Don is 2 less than your opponent, this is a 3 cost instead of a 6 cost. and it's a 2K blocker with 6K power. So sometimes I will just play it for 6 costs if I absolutely have to. The real magic with this card is if you gear 5 and you can't kill them, you could swing with your leader, swing with gear 5, play Sanji, and leave one down open for a Radical Beam, and that's an extremely strong board to be passing with. So again, if you have been getting your board removed all the way up the curve, that can be extremely powerful. How to kind of swing back if you can develop a 12K, a 6K blocker, and draw a card, um, and leave Radical Beam up even. You are moving forward on that board state pretty aggressively, and they have to have a lot of pieces to answer that. But again, the real reason it's in here is because it's a 2K counter and it's Straw Hat searchable. So that's the reason that 4 of these. This is another one that I'm pretty locked into having 4 of for the foreseeable future. I think our other 2Ks can be flexed around, but I think this one's pretty locked in. For Anosuke, I've recently flipped this over into other options because I just wasn't using the ramp or the rush from it at all. It says a Don X1. If you have 8 or more Don, this character gains rush. So realistically, it's a 6 cost 5K rush. So that's fine. I have won a game with it before, and it is Straw Hat searchable. I think until the purple ST comes out, this is this is the second best Straw Hat searcher or Straw Hat 2K if you want it to be searchable. I realized through early 07, I just was never searching for this and never really utilizing it. So I personally switched to Otama to play more into some of the removal options and to have a little bit more dynamic pressure with the minus power. This is on play, give one of your opponent's characters minus 2 power or 2K power. It's a 0 power, 1 cost, 2K counter. It's not searchable by our Ranamis. I'm on 3 of them right now. I was on 2 last set. I just like it a little bit more dynamically. Finding myself liking the effect a little bit more than I like Franosoke. But this one is a couple bucks, whereas Franosoke is basically bulk. So that is a consideration as well. But with kind of the direction my deck is going, especially, I have liked Otama just a little bit more. And then maybe this next one people would want me to put into our premiere section, but I do have it as a role player, Black Maria, and then some of the other ones here. So Black Maria has an effect that's kind of unique. Activate main if you have no other Black Marias. Put 5 down onto the field, and if you at the end of your turn you remove down until you're tied with your opponent. In our deck, some other decks really exploited this. Law really used this card exceptionally well. It's a 2K counter, Animal Kingdom Pirates. For us, this is kind of similar to Sanji, but it doesn't develop a blocker. But if you play this after your Gear 5, you're back to 10 Don the next turn. Like you can literally go basically back-to-back Gear 5s at that point. So that's kind of the more aggressive build that I've kind of alluded to, is a deck that's more like 4 Gear 5s, 4 Black Marias, and it's playing a lot of low-to-the-ground rush characters as well. So all the way up its curve, it's rushing you. Then it plays Gear 5 at 10, and then slams a Black Maria to chain another one together if it doesn't already have you killed. And that's basically the plan. It's a little bit feast or famine. We'll talk more about that in our 08 video, I think. I want to play it. I want to test it out a little bit, and maybe I'll do that on the sim a little bit more. But yeah, I think that deck does kind of fall a little bit more flat than the more traditional big body style. But I still think this is a great functional 2K, and I could see myself using it at different points and testing it out for sure. Miss Doublefinger, we already talked about what this one does. It is a 2K counter, so that's part of the reason that some people do slot into that ramp slot. I suppose if you are missing some of these other pieces, this is a pretty great option if you have it around or if you had some friends that opened OPO5. Khalifa, just kind of a generic purple 2K. When attacking, down -1, draw 2, trash 1. People love Queen because he has the same effect on a blocker. Obviously, this is a little bit less effective and does require you to play out a 2K. But it can still give you more cycle. And again, if it's a card you have around or a friend has around, it's a 2K that'll work for you in the meantime. And the last one for our role players, Uso Hachi was in my deck for a while before Sanji came out. Sanji replaced Uso Hachi in my deck. If you have 8 or more Don, Don X1 when attacking, rest up to one of your opponent's characters 4 or less. I think I used the effect like once in the entire time that I had the deck or had it in the deck. It was just a Straw Hat searchable 2K. So that's why it was quickly replaced by Sanji. But again, if you got it, you can get a playset for less than $1. So that's huge. On to our filler 2Ks. The first one's a little bit more utility based, and the rest of them are just basically straw hats, and that's the only reason that they're included. So Makino, with being able to play like Nami, and there are a couple other one costs that you could get in, like maybe Robin or elsewise. Some people do slot in Makino in a little bit more aggressive angle to your 2Ks. I haven't really gone down that route because I just don't really care to use that, I guess. But at the end of the day, it is an option. It's a 2K. It's a buck, I guess. So maybe don't go out buying them. But if you have it, if your friend has it, you can use it as a 2K while you're building out the rest of the things. And the rest, like I said, are just basically straw hats. This comes in the ST10. This Jinbei does, so it's a great early option if you get the deck. The ST10, you do have 4 straw hat searchable 2Ks. Sanji's from OPO1. Some people do like this as a utility piece if Enel is like starving you, I guess is what they've said. I personally don't see it. I don't think I ever want to take one in my own life for this effect. I don't know, maybe. But it's a Straw Hat 2K, searchable, and works for you. And then Brook, kind of again, on play, gets 2 rested down to one of your leaders or characters. I can't really imagine much of a reason why I would want to play it out. I did have it in the deck as a 2K briefly, but it's just Straw Hat 2Ks. If you got it, you got it. Premier removal slash counters. We already talked about Radical Beam, Jet Galling, and Bad Manners Kick Course in the Straw Hat Staples section. So I think those are kind of a given. But we can kind of talk about some of these other cards here. Robin, again, yes, I'm a fanboy. Deal with it. But she is incredible in the current meta. She is a 1 cost, KO up one of your opponent's characters with 1,000 power or less, Straw Hat searchable, 1K counter. Last set, I was up to 3 of them. In my exact list right now, I'm on 2. Uh, the list of cards that this removes for basically free or for 1 is phenomenal. It removes Rebecca. So any black deck is playing probably 3 to 4 Rebeccas. So besides like Black Hill Luffy, that removes all your Rebeccas, and then there's a 1K counter if you don't do that. Removes Rosinante. So if you're playing against Bonnies or any other green decks, most of them have Rosinates. It's a 1 cost blocker. It's a pain in the butt. Being able to just chip that away is a huge. When Law was bigger, and I expect to see it in other decks too, but Mister 2, you can KO an opponent's Mister 2. So I slam down a Newgate, and then I KO your Mister 2, so you can't swing at me for 10K next turn. It's pretty huge, especially when we're trying to slam big bodies. It really can save us huge. And then lastly, now into Reiju, playing Foxy Chopper. Being able to KO those chopper blockers that they're either playing off for free or using to regain some of their Don. Huge for us. Being able to just get that out of the way. And then other reducers and things can manipulate this further. And we love Robin. So again, very cheap, very good card. I would recommend 2 of them in most competitive metas that currently exist. From there, Rayleigh, like I said, this could be a threat. I'm going to be running 2 to 3 of them in this new set. I think this card is phenomenal. It is a secret in the newest set, so it is a little pricey because it just came out. So, if you're building this deck from scratch, maybe this isn't the first card you purchase. Maybe you wait a little bit longer to pick this one up. But on play, select up to 2 of your opponent's characters. One gets minus 3,000 and the other gets 2,000 until the end of your opponent's next turn. That is extremely important. So that when they go to swing at you next turn, they have to down up even more. And then you also get to KO a 3,000 power or less. So the options that this opens up for us is absolutely massive. With Doflamingo coming up in the STs, being able to check those 6K bodies is going to be amazing. Being able to chip away at wide boards like this is going to be amazing. I think this is going to be a premier removal and threat for us going forward. I wish it was a 9K, but can't be perfect. And then slow beam sword for the kind of the end of the premier removal or ramp here. I'm sorry, removal or counters here. Counter down -1, up to 1 leader gains 2, or leader or character gains 2,000, and then rest up to one of your opponent's characters. So this goes back to like kind of fundamentally when opponents are swinging into you, most often they're going to swing smallest to largest, right? That's kind of just the way you do it, so you can deny the most resources, generally speaking. Sometimes you make it even, but that's a whole different conversation. But if they go to swing at you for 6K, trying to get a card out of your hand before they swing at you with their Gecko Moria, you can say 2 Don, counter out of that hit, and rest that other massive attacker. Or rest that blocker. Both of those lines have absolutely won me games. My current configuration doesn't have slots for it, but I think especially going to like a regional, absolutely blew out a couple of people with this because they just did not see it coming. They did not know to play around. When I left two down open, they're thinking two rad beams, not slow soul beam sword. So yeah, it is something maybe as people get more aware of it, they can play around it a little bit more effectively. But kind of the most efficient lines play into your hand when you have this. But yeah, add up to one down if you hit that trigger too. So I have again 1 games off of that Don trigger as well, just being able to, another ramp option out of life. So that's my Premier removal. For some of our role players here, I actually do have Fire Fist back in my deck, so maybe I could have slotted that to Premier, but we'll run through these here. I still like this more than Shanks. Because I didn't have my Rayleigh in my deck, I was short 1 Rayleigh in my first edition of '08. I lost because I had an Ein in hand, but I did also get to use Ein to pop a Gecko that same game, so or a different game that same day. So Ein is still very powerful. I wish he was a little bit better statted or had a counter in some world, but being able to set anything to 0 and then use a Robin to KO it, or a Fire Fist to KO it, or a Newgate to KO it is feels very good. And then you get to leave Don open for your counters as well. So you could Ein, Robin, and then leave open slow beam sword. That's huge. Again, if it was like a 8K body or a 7K body or had a counter, I think this would still be in the deck. But the fact that it's a little understated, it just hurts my feelings. There's no way you could defeat me. This counter had absolutely blown out games for me. I've spoken very highly about this counter in my previous deck techs. Counter K up to one of your opponent's characters base 6,000 or less. Being able to hit a blocker or something that's downed up or just remove something from the board that's high value. Extremely powerful. Won me games against Bonnie when that's a pretty bad matchup for us. The reason I'm not on it now is because of Rayleigh. Rayleigh being able to proactively remove a 6K power and being an 8 cost while he does it. I just replaced this with going to be my third Rayleigh once I get my hands on him. So I love this card. I've won many games in the last set with this card. People still talk about this card at my locals, but at the end of the day, I just think Rayleigh offers a little bit more for what we're trying to do, and that's kind of why we move that way. But if you have it, it's a cheap card. It's phenomenal. Your jaws will literally hit the floor when you beat them with it. Fire Fist. This is another one that kind of benefits from our low life. So give up to one of your opponent's characters minus 4,000 during this turn. Then if you have 2 or less life, KO up to one of your opponent's characters with 0 or less. So this with Rayleigh is a 10 down turn that also hits a 10K and possibly 2 things while you're at it. Because Rayleigh is -3, so -4, -3 will take something from 10 down to 7. And then if they have a Rebecca or a Chopper or something else, you could also KO that while you're at it. So I re-edited this because of Rayleigh. It also out of life can do the exact same effect, which is pretty good too. But at the end of the day, I'm testing this at 2 of because of Rayleigh, and it is still good, and it benefits with the way that our leader works, right, with our rad beam synergy and things like that. So I have them in. Again, this removes all the same things as Rebecca or as Robin does, or very close to it. At least those Rebecca's and those choppers for free. And then Shanks, we already talked about Shanks. It is a removal piece. That's why people play it. 10 down plays are just hard for us. Maybe I shouldn't even be on Rayleigh for that reason, but he offers defensive flexibility too. So I don't know. I do think that resting 10 down into a lot of decks, they're going to try and kill you. Unless skilled players are going to find out if they can kill you. Then King. This was the card that was played a little bit more prior to '07. I think some people replaced it with like Dragon or other threats in '07. But it is a 6 cost 7K on play down -1 KO up to one of your opponent's characters with 4 or less. This is also very big into law, which obviously you don't have to deal with law anymore. But this was a very good threat when we were playing against that deck frequently as well. But nowadays, it's just not quite there. I have Banished Zoro in my 6 cost slot because it does have a counter and the same amount of power. But I could definitely never really critique this being in as a slot or a flex slot. Into some more filler removal slash counters. Guard point, maybe I could have put just a tiny bit higher. It's a one cost 3K counter and it has a trigger and a straw hat searchable. I've seen some people play like two of these alongside their rad beams just to have more flexibility and threat of those counter events. I don't want to see too many of those because I don't want to have to leave counter up, like down up to be able to counter out of like a 6K swing. But I definitely see it, and I definitely think it's absolutely valid because, again, your opponents that are playing around radical beams, this is what they're going to do. They're going to try and swing 6K into you as many times as possible because that requires, if you're low on card, well, I guess that's the nuance here. If you're low on cards, they're going to swing 6K into you to just get cards out of your hand. If you only have three cards in your hand and they want to get a rad beam out of it, a 6K might do it just as well as a 9K. So that if we have no other counter and you have low on life, you get kind of put up against a wall. But if you have more cards, they're going to swing 8K into you. If you have like five or six cards in hand, they're going to maybe try and swing 8K into you so that you have to use your radical beam there or give them two cards. And to that point, being able to have a little bit extra flexibility with the guard point could be huge there. But it's just not on my list. I don't, especially going into '09, I don't think there'll be slots for it, but it's an option. It comes in the ST01 starter deck. So if you got your hands on one of those, you might have a couple around as well. Slow beam. I had this in when I thought that it was counter Don -1, give up to two of your opponent's characters or leaders, but it has to be one leader and one character. It just kind of felt too specific for me. I kept trying to. I used it. Actually, my opponent let me use it to hit two characters a couple times, and in between games, I realized that was not how it worked. So it's there. If you opened '07, you probably got a couple of them. It will absolutely work. And to that dynamic that I spoke about of people trying to hit you with 6K, 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 or 7K maybe, um, being able to stop two of those attacks in the same turn for one Dom could also be a good 2-for-1 for you. But slow beam sword just is a bit more powerful, so I replaced it with slow beam sword. And I wouldn't play both slow beam and slow beam sword probably. Then we think we got a couple more here. Blast Breath. This is a one cost Don -1 4K counter. I think it's in this deck. I think it's just worse Radical Beam, and I just wouldn't run it unless you didn't have Radical Beams. It does come in STO4, so 25 cents a pop if you got it around or if a friend has a couple extra copies. But I just think Radical Beam is everything you want and more, and it's a straw hat searchable version of this. So I wouldn't spend too much time on this one. Kong Gatling. This is an ST10 card, so that's the primary reason it's included. It does KO up to 7K or less. The fact that it's 5 down and doesn't develop a body is kind of why it's not the best. But again, fills the slot. If you start with ST10, it wouldn't be the first card I rip out. But in the long run, you'll probably want to replace it with other removal options. From there, we're going to go into our blockers. So here, I think these first two are pretty firmly the best two options in the blocker slot for right now. Trafalgar, he is a 1K 4 cost 5K blocker. And on play, Don -1. If your opponent has 7 or more cards, trash 2 from their hand. So this is 2 cards at random from their 7 card or more hand. Again, going back to fundamentally this our deck. Our weakness is card economy. Most other decks are going to see more cards than us. They're going to touch 7 cards in hand much more often than we will, and being able to cut back on that advantage. I've won games just saying play law, oh, take two Ks out of your hand, and then I just beat the crap out of them the next few turns, and they never stood a chance. Or you take their biggest threat out of their hand, and they're devastated. I've lost to being lawed myself, and people will continue to lose to law. With it being a situational piece, I do say I only run 2. I could see 3. I don't really see a reason to run 4, unless maybe you bought 2 ST10s and you kind of just have it for now. Because in the late game, you're not really going to get the 7 cards too often. But obviously, it's still a blocker. And with the Don -1, with our leader effect, we can play a 7 cost and a law in the same turn. So we were just coaching somebody in the RP Luffy discussion. They were asking like, "Hey, what should I do here on a sim game?" It was actually pretty epic. And he had 10 Don, and we are like, play kid and then play law. And he was like, "Oh, I didn't even notice that I could do both. Like I didn't even think about that being an option." Then his opponent was pressured to kill Kid. He blocked with Law, and he ended up winning with like a pretty extravagant Gear 5 turn a turn later. That was a pretty hype moment in the Discord if you guys were there. But yeah, I think two of this is phenomenal. I really like this card. And it will just flip some matchups and card advantage in your favor in a huge way. Queen, I personally cannot wait to cut this card, but it is really good for what it does for right now. It's a 5 cost 6k character with a 1k counter and blocker. Down -1, draw 2, trash 1. So being able to cycle our bricks or cycle our into threats either way is phenomenal for us. To my end, the reason I don't personally love this card is that it's not a play I ever want to make. It's a play that I have to make. In the early game, if you use that Don minus too liberally, you will just put yourself behind and lose to other decks regardless of what you draw off the effect. Or alternatively, in the late game, once you're up to 8, 9 Don turns, I would rather just play a threat or a kid or a Newgate or a rush or like almost every time, right? Unless I don't have one. So right now, this is kind of the best option to help us cycle and be a blocker at the same time. In '09, I don't think I'll ever play Queen again. We can talk more about that in other videos. But right now, it is a little pricey again. So I would maybe say if you're building this deck right now, going into '09, this would not be the first play set I buy. Some people insist on 4. I play 2 right now, and I still don't really want to see it, and I often use it to counter still. But sometimes it is just a very powerful play to make a blocker and be able to, cycle through your hand. But when I'm playing into a very sweaty meta that's playing a ton of Bonnie and Lucci, and Bonnie and Lucci just laugh at Queen while they either rest it or KO it. And it just isn't really serving what the purpose that I want it to be. I want other things to be happening realistically. That being said, I'm on 2 for probably this entire set. And then in '09, it goes away for me personally. And then just double shout out on the Sanji 2K blocker. Like I said, this is one of the few 4-ofs that I'm just going to probably have in the deck for the time being. Some other options. Some people are playing more Baccarat than I am, but I think all of these additional options that you do have here are pretty solid. Specifically, I think Eustace Captain Kidd might be better in '09 with some of the utility and cards that we get access to. But that's a little bit of a separate conversation. But he's not the most pricey card, so he can kind of be weaved in here. Baccarat, 3 cost 4k blocker, 1k counter. Once per turn, you can trash a card from your hand to be a 2k counter. Again, I'm just relatively low on trying to wall up with blockers in this deck. A lot of meta decks just remove them so effectively, especially when they're this small. That being said, this does allow you to use some of your bricks as counters. And in a more aggressive meta, I could see myself slotting in more of them. If all of a sudden in '08 I'm seeing like a ton of Zoro and Reiju's a pain in my butt and like all this stuff, then maybe. But right now, it just doesn't quite make it into the list. But I definitely have a few of them set aside in case I need them. It's also very cheap. So maybe if you don't have a Queens, a play set of these can help you filter out your bricks at least. So that this is a very good sub while you are wanting to, keep that hand moving. Eustace Captain Kidd, 5 cost 6k blocker with 1k counter, and once per turn, when a Don on your field is returned to your Don deck, get an active Don. So 2 things, just the rules of the way that One Piece works. Your Gear 5, if you Don -10 and put this on bottom, you don't get the active Don from Kid because Kid is not there at that point. But if it did work, it would just negate your leader effect. It wouldn't really work with your leader effect. So it's not really a detriment to that end. The reason that this deck, I think this becomes a valid option, I expect to run it myself in '09 more specifically, is that with some of the effects and threats that remove multiple Don, we can use our leader effect and this at the same time and get 2 active Don back. And this being a play on curve that's a 6k body and a blocker, I think I'm gonna be playing it in '09. Maybe as a 2 of, they'll probably replace my queen slots if I had to guess. But right now, I don't think I'm quite there. But I want to shout it out because it's not the most expensive. And again, if you got friends that opened '05, you might have some around. Shariah, this is actually a great tech call into the mirror. this is a great tech call into Black Yellow Luffy, which even though that is a relatively favored matchup for us, it's still a great card into Black Yellow Luffy. And really, if Sabos or Whitebeards or Blue Yellow Ace has a chance to see some reps at your locals, all those leaders that also buff like we do, it's very good. So it's a 3-cost 4K blocker with 1K counter, and when it attacks or blocks, it copies your opponent's leader until starting your next turn. So when your opponent puts if your opponent puts 10 down on their leader, you block with this, it's a 15K and you counter 1. It matches their leader exactly, including the down. So it's just super powerful. And then if they're a 9K leader, you can swing into them for 9 for free. So like before Gear 5, you could swing an additional time into Black Yellow Luffy or things like that. Again, pretty cheap. If you opened 06, you might have them around. I did run it at one point, but I think it's a very solid card. And honestly, now that I think about going into 09 with the mirror, might be a consideration for some tech into the mirror, which is funny. I think that was the end of. Oh no, a couple more here for our role players. So for 08, this Charlotte Bruet is a 1K 4-cost blocker with 1K counter. On KO, get arrested down. So some decks are going to bottom deck this and not really care. Blue will bottom deck it, or some other decks might bottom deck it. But if you're playing against black decks and they have to KO it, then you do get arrested leader or arrested down, or you can just block with it. For the free for the one time to get the arrested down as well. The fact that this plays into ramp, maybe I should have played it in the ramp category as well. I don't know if I'll test this out or play it, but it is definitely something to think about. Maybe I should test it out actually now that I'm kind of thinking about it. And then finally, we have EBO1 Chopper. It's Straw Hat searchable, which we love. And then it is a 3-cost 4K blocker, like some of the other options we've seen. And it has Don X2 on it. When attacking, give up to one of your opponent's characters minus 3,000. So I've seen people play around with this, and with Don minus being potentially valid, could be very good alongside a Rayleigh or a Newgate or, with the package that we're building. Could be something there. Small blockers again. You've seen my videos. I'm playing against like 2 Luchis a week, so it's a little bit tough to really want to spend a ton of time on those blockers. But it definitely could become valid depending on what your meta is looking like. I guess I didn't realize that this card had kind of chipped up here a little bit. So maybe if you don't have them around, I wouldn't spend the money on it for this deck. But yeah, I guess that is a little bit pricier than I had last checked. And then filler blockers. I guess really I shouldn't have Uta as a filler blocker because I did play it and I did like it. But it does just fall into the same faults as other things being removed. So that's kind of why I don't have it. Or I don't know if I'd recommend like purchasing it per se, but I had it and I did run it. But then Uta, it comes from the ST05 film starter deck. It's a 4-cost 5K blocker with 1K counter, so same stat line as Law. But on block, Don -1, rest up to one of your opponent's characters with a cost 5 or less. So it just changes the way your opponent has to swing into you. If they're planning to use their Lucci effect to minus this blocker, they have to consider that. You can rest one of their blockers or rest one of their attackers, or they're a Brook if they're planning on using that to KO. So it does make your opponent think a little bit more. Again, it is being fairly removable and not offering any immediate utility is kind of why I removed it. But what I will say about this is if you're playing that counter event, there's no way you could defeat me. Uta plus there's no way you could defeat me makes your opponent have to think so hard about the way that they're going to sequence their attacks, and they aren't probably going to account for both properly, realistically. I remember I had a line where everything they had besides their Shariah was bigger than 5. So they're like, oh, I'll just put 3 or 4 down on my Shariah first and then swing into you. And I just said, okay, yeah, KO that Shariah. and they had to kind of decide what to do from there. And that was one less attacker. I blocked the next attack that they sent that was bigger, and then I countered out of whatever else I think. Yeah, they're just absolutely not ready. Also, in a double blocker turn, this is insane too. If you play like Queen or Law followed by Uta, again, maybe Lucci can still pop it without having to swing, but it offers a lot of utility into those lines, and it creates a much more robust defensive wall, or again, just rest their Sabo and be able to have, one blocker out of the way or something like that. So maybe this is a little bit better than a filler, but it's a few bucks and I don't run it anymore. So maybe it's not the best first purchase. Shiki, this is from '06. So again, if you open some '06, you'll have these around, I imagine. It's a 2 cost 1K counter with 1K blocker with 1K counter. And on play, if you have 8 or more Don, you draw one, trash one. It's kind of like a Queen Light. Again, removed so easily that I just haven't really spent the time on it. But it cycles a card. It's what you want to do. If you got it around, it'll get the job done for you. Chopper. I've seen some people a little bit higher on it. It would kind of be like a light version of Sanji, in my opinion. Um, if you gear 5, you can play this, get arrested Don, and have 2 active still for whatever other plays you want to make. Besides that, we're not very often going to be at less Don than our opponent, or we don't want to be. So for the most part, it's just going to be a 0 counter or 0 power blocker with 1K counter until you gear 5. So that's why I haven't really played with it yet. But again, if you open some '07, it will be a filler, and it kind of lets you play that gear 5 into blocker line that really only Lucci gets to punish you then, or if he gets to just play a Lucci and pop it for free. Eh. But everyone else kind of has to consider that blocker or do something to it for the most part. So after a gear 5 tempo, it can still be a solid play. Jinbei, this is an '05 blocker, 5 cost, 6K. And if you have 10 down on your field, it's a 7K blocker on your opponent's turn. It's Straw Hat searchable if it fits the role. Marco. Oh, this one is down to $1. I've seen $1 Marco. 4 cost, 5K, 1K counter blocker. That says if you have 2 or less life, you can trash a Whitebeard card from your hand when this gets KO'd to get this back rested. So, if you play this turn 2, you might still have your 3 life or whatever. But hypothetically, if you're playing Newgate, you could, if you have, a Newgate left over in hand, or you had to play a blocker or whatever, you could potentially use that Newgate from hand to return this. Again, it's not something I really go seek out, but if you got it around '02, you previously played Whitebeard, or your friend played Whitebeard or something, you could potentially use that. And finally, just our chopper blocker from the ST01, 1 cost, 1K, no counter blocker. Fits the role. If you had a '01, then you probably got a few of these. You can use it. I've seen some people just include it as a 1-up just to have another thing. Like they just say like, oh, well, it's searchable, and sometimes I get to play 2 blockers instead of 1 blocker. Maybe I'm just jaded from playing against so many Luchis or something, but I wouldn't slot it for it, but it works. It works. So hopefully I didn't say that too many times about, the filler here, but that kind of hits the end of it. So where do we go from here? I think with my 0-8 video, I would really, really love to hear some more feedback about what you want to see out of that. My initial thought is some of the cards that we're considering, some potential deck lists for 0-8. But maybe I could go a bit more specific into matchups if you'd like to hear some more content about that or how you want to play around that. And then again, I'm very active in the RP Luffy discussion and OPTCG. I'm also very active in VV Theory's Discord. So if you're in either of those or want to get in either of those, feel free to reach out to me or message me on Discord, whatever. I'm glad to help kind of suggest upgrades or where to go. If you give me a budget or what you got or what you're thinking about, I'll gladly help out. But at the end of the day, have fun. I think this deck is insanely fun. And again, being able to create that dynamic of having an advantage in the scenario just feels so great. I really enjoy it. So I hope you guys enjoyed today. Like I said, I'm going to timestamp all this at some point so you can kind of go back through this and cycle through it conveniently. But I appreciate anyone that made it this far. Please leave a comment if you did.